Hello everybody, Patman QC here. On today's episode, we are going to talk about pro wrestling video games. Not just any pro wrestling video games. These games feature the limousine riding, jet flying, kiss stealing, wheeling dealing, son of a gun, the 16-time world heavyweight champion, the Nature Boy, Ric Flair. Speaking of bad Ric Flair impressions, check this out. Woo! That's right. These games all feature Ric Flair at his finest. Some of these games you've probably never heard of. They are both Japanese and North American releases. But it doesn't matter, because these are the top 5 games that feature Nature Boy Ric Flair. Come on, let's get this thing started with number 5. Number 5 is Day of Reckoning 2, released by THQ for the GameCube. This was considered the spiritual successor to the Aki series of games on the Nintendo 64, which we will absolutely talk about later in this video. The game features improved graphics over its predecessor and a few new features, such as the stamina system and the lift system. The game featured branching paths, which immensely helped the replay value. The Creator Wrestler feature also returns, only this time there are twice as many parts for customization. Speaking of Ric Flair, he has a lot of his trademark moves, and his entrance features his actual WCW music, which was the main theme from 2001: A Space Odyssey. This helped to authenticate the actual Nature Boy entrance, which in the past always used his generic WWF 1991 theme song. Speaking of Ric Flair in the WWF in 1991, number 4 brings us to WWF Royal Rumble for the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis. This was an updated version of the original Super Nintendo game Super WrestleMania. The big difference this time around is that the wrestlers have their own signature moves. The problem though is all of the wrestlers otherwise have the exact same movesets and attributes. The game also added the Royal Rumble mode, which was appearing for the first time in a video game. This mode is a lot of fun, but when there are 6 characters on screen at once, the game does lag just a bit. The graphics are really well done, especially for an early 16-bit title. The sprites are large and detailed and easily recognizable. Vince McMahon and Bobby Heenan are both sitting at ringside at the commentary table. Another awesome feature that was first introduced in this game is the wrestler's entrance music. This really shows off the power of the Super Nintendo audio chip because the entrance music sounds amazing. Ric Flair has his WWF music, but unfortunately it's his generic version. It still sounds great, but it's not as good as the one we all know and love. Number 3 is WWE Smackdown, Here Comes the Pain for the PlayStation 2. The game engine started out with the very first Smackdown game on the original PlayStation. The series was known for its fast gameplay, but with this one, the game engine was expanded upon and a more complicated grappling system was introduced. This game is notable for having one of the best rosters of any wrestling game in the USA. It was also the introduction of 2 distinct match types. The first one was the ever clever Elimination Chamber, and the other one, the always sexy Bra and Panties match. Hubba hubba. One of my favorite types was the season mode. With this one, there are multiple branching paths plus the ability to choose which brand you want to wrestle on. You start your season on the Backlash pay-per-view and end up at WrestleMania. There are also multiple world titles to go after. The graphics are very nice with large detailed models of each wrestler. The animation is nice and smooth, and the gameplay of the series was just hitting its stride. Ric Flair looks good, and that includes his 10 pounds of gold, the WCW World Heavyweight title. He doesn't have his entrance music, but instead uses the music from Evolution. This game still has a cult following among hardcore pro wrestling video gamers. Styling and profiling at number 2 is Virtual Pro Wrestling 64 for the Nintendo 64. This almost made the top spot as the race was very close. This is the sequel to Virtual Pro Wrestling, or WCW vs. the World on the PlayStation 1, only this time with a much bigger roster and greatly improved controls. Now in Japan, copyright laws are, shall we say, just a bit lax, so the roster includes characters from All Japan and New Japan, as well as WCW and the entire NWO. The only official license is the WCW brand, so while all of the other characters look and act like their real-life counterparts, they all have different names. This also included elements of MMA fighting, something the American counterpart WCW vs. NWO World Tour did not have. As I mentioned before, I've known people in the gaming industry for quite some time. There were 2 WCW games coming out at the same time. The first one was this one, and just based solely on the graphics alone, looked okay. The other one was WCW Nitro for the PS1, which looked amazing to me. When speaking to one of my contacts, I informed him that I was really looking forward to WCW Nitro. He laughed and said to forget about that one because the game was garbage. He told me to forget about that one and instead get this one. And you know what? He was right. The game features 4-player simultaneous wrestling action, and in my humble opinion, the gameplay still hasn't been touched. And while its sequel, Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 or WWF No Mercy, might have more options, this was the one that started it all on the Nintendo 64. There aren't ring entrances or music, as this was done on a cartridge, so space was very limited. Sure, the graphics look a bit blocky, but the animation is nice and smooth and the playability is excellent. Here we are 20 years later, and we are still talking about the series of games. The modding community have managed to create some wonderful packs that actually transform the game into something else, with high-res models and different match types. And finally, strutting in at number 1 is Super Fire Pro Wrestling Special from Human Software. Released only in Japan. This was the game that introduced timing-based gameplay into the world of professional wrestling video games. The gameplay takes a bit to get used to at first, but after some practice, you'll be pulling those moves out in no time. The very first Fire Pro game was titled Fire Pro Wrestling Combination Tag and was released on the PC Engine in 1989. The animation was very stiff and the roster had just only 20 characters, but compared to what we were getting on the NES at the time, it was a masterpiece. The series would continue on to the Super Famicom with a grand total of 6 games released on that console alone. Once again, thanks to the wonderful lax copyright laws, we have a grand total of just over 100 real wrestlers from all over the world with all of their actual movesets and attributes. Another great feature of the Fire Pro series is the always robust Create a Wrestler feature. The game is probably 95% Japanese, so it takes a bit to figure out the menus, but it's well worth the time once you do. There are also screen menu translations available online or a ROM hack translations made by the fans. The game's storyline revolves you trying to win the world title. The game takes many twists and turns, but is most notable for its dark ending. Towards the end of the game, after the death of your best friend and coach, you have to rise up and defeat the World Heavyweight Champion Dick Slender, aka Ric Flair. After a few days of being the World Heavyweight Champion and wondering if all the sacrifices you've made are worth it, you put a gun in your mouth and end it all. Yikes, it doesn't get much more dark than that, folks. The series would go on for a number of years, including the last release on the PS4, which was Fire Pro Wrestling World, and it was finally released in English. And there you have it, the top 5 retro wrestling video games featuring the Nature Boy Ric Flair. These are all lots of fun to play, so if you're a wrestling game fan, be sure and check these out. You'll be glad you did. Remember, diamonds are forever, and so is Ric Flair. Woo! Remember, you can always support me on Patreon by clicking the link below. Every dollar helps, and I appreciate all the support. Also, be sure to like, share, and subscribe my content. It's the only way my channel can grow. Thanks for watching.